During a devastating flood, a merchant spots two children struggling to survive in the raging waters, and without hesitation, risks their own life to save them. Nicholas was 30 years old and, until recently, had led a quiet life. He had always been a peaceful man, known for his admirable patience and generous heart. He was respected for his kindness and for treating everyone with respect, no matter who they were. His small candy shop was his greatest pride, a cozy place where regular customers became friends, and the smell of sugar and vanilla brought comfort to the neighborhood. Since he was young, he had enjoyed making sweets, a skill he had inherited from his grandmother, and he had turned this passion into a livelihood. His routine was simple, but he cherished it, opening the shop in the morning, preparing the day's confections, serving customers with a smile, and, at the end of the day, returning home to rest beside his wife. He believed he had a stable life, free from major surprises or upheavals. However, this illusion of stability was brutally shattered when he discovered that his wife, the woman he had shared 5 years of marriage with, was cheating on him. The truth hit him like a blunt blow. A deep wound he couldn't avoid. The separation was inevitable and painful, dragging down everything Nicholas had known as home. As part of the agreement, his ex-wife kept the house they had lived in together, and he was forced to leave. The decision, though legally fair, left him adrift. He had nowhere to go, no close family to take him in. All he had left was his shop, the only place he could still call his own. With no other options, Nicholas turned a small room in the back of the shop into his new home. The space was cramped, barely fitting his bed and a few belongings. The adjustment was tough, but he did his best to maintain his dignity, organizing the space as best he could. In the customer restroom, he installed an improvised shower, allowing him to at least bathe without needing to find another solution. The shop's ovens doubled as his kitchen, where he heated the solitary meals he ate in silence. That day, the rain had been pounding the city since dawn, a thick curtain of water streaming down the streets and rooftops as if the sky itself had split open. Inside his small shop, Nicholas worked as usual, serving the few customers who braved the storm. One of the customers, an elderly man who often bought caramels, adjusted his wet umbrella as he entered the shop and let out a tired sigh. "This rain just won't let up," he said, stomping his feet on the mat to shake off the excess water. "Yeah," Nicholas replied, placing the change on the counter. "And it looks like it's only going to get worse. Unfortunately, this area floods really quickly. It's the same thing every year." The man nodded in agreement. "What about your shop? Does the water get in?" "Luckily, no. It's well above street level. I've never had any flooding issues here." The customer nodded, grabbing his bag of caramels and preparing to leave. "Well, I'd better get going before I need a boat to get back home." "Take care," Nicholas said, watching the man open his umbrella and disappear into the rain. Silence filled the shop as the door closed, and Nicholas stood still for a moment, listening to the rhythmic sound of water hitting the shop's window. He looked outside and noticed the rain was getting heavier, turning into a grey, turbulent blanket. The few pedestrians hurried along, trying to escape the impending storm. Realizing he was unlikely to get more customers that day, Nicholas decided to close up shop. He locked everything and went to the cash register, where he began counting the money. Minutes passed, and Nicholas continued counting the cash, focused on the task. The sound of the rain outside was deafening, hammering against the roof and windows with unusual intensity. He was used to storms in the area, but this one seemed fiercer than usual. For a moment, he looked away from the bills and glanced outside. What he saw made his stomach churn. The street had disappeared. The water was already alarmingly high, covering the sidewalks and advancing relentlessly. The flow was chaotic, violent, dragging along boxes, trash bags, branches, and even heavy objects like chairs and pieces of wood. Some of the neighboring shops' doors were already half submerged, and the current seemed to gain strength with every second. "My God," he murmured, dropping the money on the counter and stepping closer to the door to get a better look. The rain didn't stop. On the contrary, it seemed to fall with even more fury, punishing everything in its path. Nicholas had seen floods before, but nothing even remotely like this. Normally the water rose slowly, giving people time to react. But this time, it was as if the deluge had been dumped on the city all at once. Swallowing hard, he returned to the counter and quickly finished counting the money, stashing it in the safe. His breathing was tense. He grabbed a cloth and began wiping down the counter out of pure reflex, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease inside him. But the roar of the storm grew louder. The water, which had been rising quickly, now seemed to be swallowing the entire street in the blink of an eye. He stopped cleaning and looked out the window again. His chest tightened as he saw that in just a few minutes the water had risen even higher. The tops of some benches in the square were already disappearing, and what had once been a road now looked like a turbulent river, ready to invade everything around it. This was dangerous. Suddenly, a sound cut through the roar of the storm. Shouts, desperate ones. He dropped the cloth and ran to the door. He climbed the small steps leading to the shop's entrance and, looking outside, felt a chill run down his spine. The water was already halfway up the doors of nearby houses. Objects floated in the violent current, pieces of wood, bags, even furniture. But what made his heart race were two small figures being swept away by the flood, a girl and a boy. They were struggling against the force of the water, flailing, their faces marked by desperation. The current pulled them violently, submerging them repeatedly. Their screams were drowned out by the roar of the storm. Nicholas didn't think. His body moved before his mind could process it. Without hesitation, he plunged into the water. The shock of the cold cut through his skin like knives. The current was much stronger than he had imagined. The flow pushed him back, spinning him around for a moment before he regained control. Fighting against the force of the flood, he began swimming toward the children. Each stroke was a monumental effort. The heavy, murky water made it impossible to see anything below the surface. The sound of the wind and rain mixed with the pounding of his own heart. When he finally reached the boy, who looked to be about 10 years old, he grabbed him firmly by the arm and pulled him up. The boy coughed, choking on the dirty water. "Hold on tight to me," Nicholas shouted, feeling the boy's weight making it harder to move. The girl was further ahead, being dangerously swept toward a partially submerged wooden structure, perhaps a fence knocked down by the flood. Nicholas mustered all his strength and pushed forward, feeling his muscles protest against the effort. His lungs were already burning for air. His body ached, but he couldn't stop. With one last push, he grabbed the girl by the waist just before she was thrown against the wood. She was sobbing, her little face pale with fear. "I've got you," he said, his voice hoarse from the effort. Now came the hardest part. He had to get back. Carrying the weight of both children, Nicholas found himself completely at the mercy of the current. The water pulled him in every direction, trying to tear the children from his arms. His body screamed in exhaustion, but he refused to let go of either of them. The shop was still visible, but it seemed miles away. "Hold on! We're almost there," he said, even as he felt his strength fading. The struggle against the water became a desperate battle. Every meter he swam felt like a kilometer. His legs burned with fatigue, his arms trembled, but he kept going. Finally, when he felt his body couldn't take another second, his feet touched something solid. The submerged ground of the street. With one final effort, he dragged the children to the small steps at the shop's entrance and pushed them up. He climbed up after them, collapsing inside, unable to stand. His lungs burned for air. His body felt like lead. But they were alive. The children coughed, shivering. The boy held his sister tightly, as if afraid to let her go. Nicholas struggled to his feet, leaning on the counter. He looked at the children and said, his voice weak but firm, "This is my shop. You can stay here until the water goes down." The storm continued to roar outside, and the water rose mercilessly, turning the city into a turbulent sea. Inside the shop, Nicholas struggled to catch his breath, still feeling the weight of the rescue. His body ached, his muscles were exhausted, but he couldn't think about that now. He looked at the two children huddled in the corner, still trembling from the cold and fear. The boy held his sister tightly, as if afraid she might disappear at any moment. "Are you okay?" Nicholas asked, trying to sound calm despite the exhaustion in his voice. The girl, who looked to be about 8, nodded, but her wide, frightened eyes said otherwise. The boy, around 10, swallowed hard and answered hesitantly, "Cold." Nicholas looked at them and knew he had to act fast. They were soaked, shivering, and if they didn't warm up soon, they could get sick. "Come with me. I'll get you something to dry off." Nicholas led them to the back of the shop, where the small bathroom he had been using since he started living there was located. The space was simple, with an improvised shower and a small sink, but it was enough to offer some comfort. He opened a nearby cabinet and grabbed 2 clean towels, handing one to each of them. "Go in and take a warm shower. It'll help you warm up," he said, trying to sound reassuring. The two hesitated for a moment, still huddled and shivering. The girl held her brother's arm tightly, as if she didn't want to let him go even for a second. Nicholas noticed this and crouched down slightly to speak more gently. "It's going to be okay. You can shower together if you want. While you do that, give me your wet clothes, and I'll wash and dry them in the oven. That way, when you're done, you'll have something warm to wear." The boy finally nodded, pulling his sister into the bathroom. A moment later, he opened the door a crack and handed the soaked clothes to Nicholas, who took them carefully. "When you're done, let me know, and I'll bring you the dry clothes." The boy made a small sound of acknowledgement before closing the door again. Nicholas stood still for a moment, listening to the sound of the shower being turned on. The sound of running water was a relief. At least now they would be warm. With the wet clothes in hand, he washed them and then went to the shop's kitchen, where he turned on the oven and placed the clothes on the rack to dry, making sure the heat reached them evenly. A little later, he heard a timid voice from the bathroom. "We're done." Nicholas grabbed the dry clothes and knocked lightly on the door. The boy opened it a crack, and Nicholas handed him the clothes. "Here, get dressed quickly. It's much warmer now." The boy took the clothes carefully and closed the door again. Nicholas took a deep breath, feeling a slight relief, knowing that, at least for now, the children were safe. After giving the children their dry clothes, Nicholas went back to the improvised kitchen. The oven was still on, spreading a welcome warmth through the room. He grabbed 2 mugs and started warming some milk, making sure it was warm enough to heat them up without burning. Meanwhile, he opened one of the cabinets and found a pack of butter cookies. It wasn't a full meal, but at least it would give them something to chew on. A little later, he heard hesitant footsteps approaching. The boy and girl appeared at the edge of the kitchen, now dressed in their dry clothes. They were still a bit hunched over, their hair damp and their eyes carrying the exhaustion of the fear they had faced, but they looked more comfortable. "Come sit down," Nicholas said, pulling out 2 chairs for them. The siblings looked at each other before slowly approaching and sitting down. The girl held onto the sleeve of her shirt tightly, and the boy kept a watchful eye on Nicholas, as if still trying to figure out if they could trust him. Nicholas placed a mug of warm milk in front of each of them and pushed the pack of cookies closer. "Eat and drink. It'll help you warm up." The girl picked up the mug with both small hands and blew lightly on the steam before taking a sip. Her face relaxed a bit as she felt the warmth spread through her. The boy, after hesitating for a moment, followed his sister's lead. She looked at the pack of cookies, took one and took a small bite, chewing slowly. Her eyes widened slightly, and she quickly grabbed another piece. The boy looked at her and, seeing that it seemed safe, took one for himself, chewing more slowly. "Do you like them?" Nicholas asked, watching them. The girl nodded with her mouth full and replied in a muffled voice, It's good. The boy swallowed before speaking. Thank you. You're welcome, Nicholas said, sitting down across the table. You must be starving after everything you've been through. The boy looked at him, seeming to ponder something. After swallowing another bite of the cookie, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and in a hesitant tone asked, Is this your home? Nicholas rested his elbows on the table and sighed before answering. Sort of. I used to live somewhere else, but now I live here, in the back of the shop. The boy frowned. Why? Nicholas hesitated, but then gave a slight smile. Life sometimes changes in ways we don't expect. He looked at the two of them and added, But don't worry, this is a safe place. The girl looked at her mug, distracted, as if trying to organize her thoughts. Our house got flooded, she murmured, her voice almost disappearing. The boy pressed his lips together and looked down. After a few seconds, he took a deep breath and started speaking. We were there when it started raining really hard. Our mum told us to grab some things because the water might come in. She tried to save some clothes, put them on the table. He paused, as if the words were heavy. But the water rose really fast. By the time we realized, it was already up to our legs. The girl clenched her fingers around the mug. We got scared. The boy nodded. Our mom tried to get us out, but a big piece of wood came floating in the current. She pushed us out of the way, but she couldn't get out of the path herself. His voice faltered a bit, and he took a deep breath before continuing. She was swept away by the water. The girl sniffled and rubbed her eyes with her sleeve. We ran after her. The boy finished, his voice choked. But the current was too strong. We lost sight of her. Silence returned, heavy. Nicholas felt a tightness in his chest. There were no right words to ease that pain, but he had to try. We'll find her, he said firmly. Tomorrow, when the water goes down, I'll take you to a safe place. They'll help us look for your mom. The siblings looked at him, uncertain, but Nicholas saw a small spark of hope in their eyes. Do you think she's okay? The boy asked, his voice low. Nicholas nodded. She seems really strong. If she did everything she could to save you, I'm sure she found a way to save herself too. The boy looked away, absorbing those words. After they finished eating and drinking, Nicholas grabbed some blankets. You can sleep in my bed. I'll take the couch. The girl looked at him, frowning. But what about you? Where will you sleep? On the couch in the shop. Don't worry about me. The boy hesitated, but then pulled his sister onto the makeshift bed and settled under the blanket. Thank you, he said, his voice already heavy with sleep. Good night, Nicholas replied, turning off the light. The small bodies soon quieted, and their breathing became slow and steady. Nicholas watched them for a moment, feeling a strange warmth in his chest. He lay down on the couch, closed his eyes, and listened to the rain outside. For the first time in a long time, he felt that his shop wasn't empty. The next morning, Nicholas woke up to the first rays of sunlight filtering through the window. The silence was strange after the storm the night before. For a moment, he lay on the couch. The room felt different, as if the chaos outside had transformed into something calmer and more hopeful. He got up and went to the shop's door. When he opened it, he felt the fresh morning air fill the space. The sky was clear, blue, and peaceful, as if trying to erase the traces of the storm's fury. Outside, the water still covered much of the street, but it was starting to recede. Some neighbors were coming out of their homes, assessing the damage and cleaning up what they could. Nicholas sighed and looked inside. The children were still curled up on the makeshift bed, their faces relaxed from exhaustion. He smiled slightly before heading to the kitchen. He prepared a simple breakfast: warm milk, some slices of bread, and a bit of butter. The smell soon filled the room. A little later, he heard the sound of sheets rustling. The girl was the first to wake up, blinking her sleepy eyes and stretching slowly. "Good morning," Nicholas said, smiling. She rubbed her eyes before murmuring a timid, "Good morning." The boy woke up soon after, sitting up in bed and looking around as if he needed to remember where he was. "Did the rain stop?" he asked, his voice still hoarse from sleep. "It stopped," Nicholas replied. "The water's going down. Today we'll leave here and find a safe place for you." The two nodded, still looking a bit sleepy. Nicholas pulled out chairs for the table and gestured for them to sit. "Eat before we go. It's going to be a long day." The children obeyed, picking up the bread with their small hands and taking slow bites. The silence was comfortable, just the sound of the meal filling the room. When they finished, Nicholas grabbed some backpacks he kept for carrying shop supplies and put some dry clothes and a blanket inside. "Ready?" he asked, slinging the backpack over his shoulder. The boy held his sister's hand and nodded. "Yes." They left the shop, stepping into the shallow water that still covered part of the sidewalk. Nicholas carried the girl in his arms, as the ground was slippery and he didn't want to risk her falling. The journey was slow, navigating around debris scattered across the city. "Where are we going?" the boy asked, looking around. "There's a rescue post at a nearby school," Nicholas replied. "The authorities and volunteers are helping people who lost their homes or got separated during the storm. They'll help us find your mum." The boy held onto Nicholas's backpack strapped tighter, nodding without saying anything. When they reached the school, the activity was intense. Many people were gathered, some sitting on the ground with blankets, others receiving medical attention. Volunteers were distributing food and dry clothes. A man in an orange vest approached as soon as he saw them. "Do you need help?" he asked, looking at the children. "These two got separated from their mom during the flood," Nicholas explained. "I found them yesterday and took care of them. We don't know if their mom has been rescued yet." The man nodded with a look of understanding. "We'll take care of them. We're registering all separated families and trying to reunite people." The girl looked at Nicholas with a mix of fear and uncertainty. "Will you stay with us?" He knelt in front of her and smiled gently. "I'll stay as long as you need me." The volunteers took down the children's names and asked a few questions while Nicholas stayed by their side. The boy held his sister's hand tightly, and with each passing second, his eyes grew more anxious, until a sound made everyone's heart freeze. A commotion started at the entrance of the rescue post. Several rescuers ran to help someone who had just arrived. A woman, visibly injured and weak, was being carried by two volunteers. Her face was dirty with mud, her wet hair stuck to her skin, and her breathing was heavy, as if she had spent hours fighting the current. The children's eyes widened. "Mom!" the girl shouted, letting go of her brother and running toward her. The boy froze for a moment, but then ran after his sister. The woman, seeing her children running toward her, fell to her knees, tears streaming down her bruised face. As soon as the children threw themselves into her arms, desperate sobs filled the air. "My babies!" she cried, holding them tightly. "I thought I'd never see you again." The girl sobbed loudly, clinging to her mother, and the boy trembled, holding her with all his strength. The scene made many around them stop and watch, moved. Nicholas stood still, watching in silence. A lump formed in his throat and he looked away for a moment, trying to compose himself. The scene before him was deeply moving. A mother and her children finally reunited after a terrifying night. The pain and fear they had carried until that moment seemed to dissolve in that tight embrace, filled with desperate sobs and broken words. He took a step back, feeling his role there was done. He was about to walk away when he noticed the boy whispering something in his mother's ear. The woman, still holding her children, looked up, searching for someone around her. Then her eyes met Nicholas's. She frowned for a moment, confused, and then looked at her son. "Is that him?" she asked, her voice low but filled with emotion. The boy nodded vigorously. "It's him, Mom. He jumped into the water and saved us." The girl, still holding her mother tightly, looked at Nicholas and smiled, even as tears streamed down her face. He took care of us. He gave us food, dry clothes, and brought us here. The woman brought a hand to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears once more. Her expression was a mix of shock, gratitude, and an emotion she couldn't contain. She tried to stand, but her knees gave out. One of the rescuers held her by the arm. With effort, she steadied herself and then walked toward Nicholas, her eyes fixed on him as if she were facing a miracle. When she stood in front of him, her voice came out trembling. You saved my children." Nicholas hesitated for a moment. He had never been one to like being called a hero. But as he looked into the eyes of this mother, a woman who, in a single day, had almost lost everything, he simply nodded, a humble smile forming on his lips. "I did what anyone should do," he replied, his voice firm but gentle. The woman let out a sob, covering her face with her hands for a brief moment. Then, without thinking twice, she grabbed Nicholas's hands and squeezed them tightly. Thank you, she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I have no words. If it weren't for you—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence, because the thought of what could have happened if Nicholas hadn't acted was unbearable. The boy tugged on Nicholas's sleeve. "You were so brave," he said admiringly. "You were like a superhero." Nicholas chuckled lightly and ruffled the boy's hair. "I'm not a superhero," he said, joking. "I just couldn't let you two get lost in that water." The girl held her mother's hand and looked at Nicholas with a sweet smile. "You're our hero." Those words warmed something inside Nicholas. For a long time, he hadn't felt like he had a real purpose. Since his separation, since he had turned the back of his shop into his makeshift home, he had just existed, passing the days without expecting anything from the future. But now he knew his life had made a difference. The volunteers began leading the woman to one of the areas reserved for medical care, making sure she was looked after. The children, however, didn't let go of her hand, as if afraid she might disappear again. Before being led inside, the woman looked at Nicholas one more time. "If you ever need anything at all, come find me," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. Nicholas nodded, feeling that he didn't need anything more than that moment. He watched them as they walked away, the mother holding each child as if she would never let them go. He took a deep breath and for the first time in a long time felt a lightness in his chest. He left the rescue post and looked up at the sky. It was clear, with no trace of the storm that had ravaged the city the night before. The sun shone softly between the scattered clouds. It was almost symbolic, as if the weight he had carried for so long had finally dissipated. The waters had taken many things, but they had given him something precious in return, the chance to make a difference in someone's life. He returned to his shop, feeling that his life, once marked by loneliness, now had a new meaning. In the months that followed, Nicholas discovered that the encounter didn't end there. The mother and children began visiting his shop frequently. The girl loved trying the candies, and the boy asked questions about how the ovens and recipes worked. Slowly, Nicholas realized that he hadn't just saved those children, they had saved him too. And so, over time, the loneliness that had accompanied him was replaced by something new. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.